All right, President Obama violated the Constitution. That, according to the U.S. Court of Appeals. It's cut and dry, right? It found the president's recess appointments to the National Labor Relations Board exceeded his authority. And the White House's response, at this point, they have just ignored it. So can they do that? Let's ask Fox News senior judicial analyst Judge Andrew Napolitano. Judge,
Ryan,
how could you ignore a ruling?
Well, you know, this ruling changes what presidents of both parties have liberally done in the past 75 years. They present a nominee to the Senate. The Senate refuses to consider the person, or the president decides he doesn't have enough votes in the Senate to confirm the nomination. So they wait until the Senate is in recess. I'm going in quotes for a reason. And then when the Senate is in recess, they just put the person in office, because there's a clause in the Constitution that says when the Senate is in recess, the president may put a person in office that would otherwise require Senate confirmation until the end of the next session of Congress. Well, President Obama did that so liberally, so aggressively, particularly with some members of the National Labor Relations Board, that some businesses offended by what the NLRB did challenged the fact that these guys weren't really members of the NLRB, and the Supreme Court agreed. Excuse me, not the Supreme Court. The United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, right below the Supreme Court, agreed and said, when the Senate will decide when it's in recess, not the President of the United States. So if senators go home at 5 o'clock at night and come back at 7 o'clock the next morning, that's not recess. If they go home for Thanksgiving, that's not recess. It's only when they shut down and stop their business, like at Christmas time, that's the recess.
And now, the thing is, the best example during the Bush years was Ambassador Bolton. Wasn't going to get passed. The Senate goes in recess. The President puts him forward. He gets to serve for a year and a half, for 2 years.
Under this opinion, as much as we know and like and respect John Bolton, his nomination, his appointment would have been invalid, because the court said the vacancy must arise during the recess, meaning the job must become open then, and it has to be filled during the recess.
But Judge, how outrageous is to, especially to somebody like you who studies the law, we go by the rulings, to have the White House ignore a ruling? Why don't we start ignoring the White House then?
That's a very, very serious issue, because the National Labor Relations Board does not have a valid number of people on it. Therefore, everything they've done with these two people on it and everything they continue to do is invalid, and the White House is doing nothing about that.
So should corporations start ignoring the White House's rules and the National Labor Relations?
Very serious problem, and a great question, Brian, when the government breaks its own laws. Because when the government breaks its own laws, the country becomes lawless, and people think that they can break the law. And then when the government decides what laws to obey and what laws to disobey, government becomes a king.
In your judgment, what breaks this? What breaks this deadlock? What breaks the...
If the Supreme Court affirms what the appeals court did, that will end it with finality, and the White House, there's nothing the White House can do about it. But in the interim, every time some official who wasn't confirmed by the Senate does something and someone's offended by it, they're going to have to sue that official to get what the official did invalidated by the court. It's a long and tortuous process, unless the White House follows what this court told them to.
On the surface, it's a huge setback for the White House, but unless they ignore it, how can it be a setback if a ruling falls in the woods and no one pays attention to it? Do you hear it?
I understand what you're talking about.
Is that too deep for you, Judge?
That is the greatest accumulation of mixed metaphors I've ever heard, Brian.
It'll never be replicated. Shepard Smith, you're served, pal. Go ahead.
If the president wants to ignore the laws and the Congress lets him and the courts don't do anything about it, he'll get away with it. And this president is a champion at doing that and getting away with it.
All right, Judge Napolitano, also a champion of the law.
You missed me on that radio show?
Of course. But we get to see you on television twice a week, and that's great. Thanks so much, Judge, for coming by again.
You're a stinker. I'll see you in New Orleans.
All right.